Hi everybody and welcome back to another History TV video. Me, Mr. Perkins. In today's video we're going to have a look at the Catholic plots against Elizabeth I that took place between 1571 and 1586. We're going to look and recap why Catholics in England and abroad were annoyed with Elizabeth I. We're then going to take a look in turn at the three plots that took place against her during the time frame there. And then we'll finish off by just taking a look at the significance of those plots for a variety of things. I'm going to start off today by introducing my knowledge organiser for this. Today's knowledge organiser does also include the revolt of the Northern Earls, which I'm not going to talk about so much in this video today. Instead, I'm going to focus on the three plots that took place after the Northern Rebellion. So that is the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and the Babington plot. And we're going to, as I say, going to look at the significance of those plots for how, for example, Elizabeth treated Catholics, and what it also meant, perhaps fundamentally, for Mary Queen of Scots, who arrived in England in 1568. I think one of the key things to emphasise here is that all four of the revolts and plots that we study as part of the EdXL course anyway, is that they all take place after Mary Queen of Scots arrives in England and is imprisoned by Elizabeth I. And that's probably because in arriving in England, it actually presented English Catholics with an even greater opportunity now to depose Elizabeth and actually have an alternative queen, one who actually was Catholic. Of course, Elizabeth was not, as you know already. Her religious settlement made the Church of England a Protestant church again. So a little overview to start with. As we've kind of already discussed in previous videos, historians now believe that most people in early Elizabethan England were in fact Catholic, whereas Protestants made up a pretty sizable minority, but certainly were not in the majority. We know that Elizabeth had created the religious settlement in 1559, where the Church of England became Protestant once again after the reign of Mary I, her half-sister. But to make it a compromise to some extent, some Catholic features were kept. For example, the appearance of the churches themselves remained relatively Catholic in their appearance. Things like interpretation of scripture was left quite vague, which meant that Catholics and Protestants could interpret scripture in the way that they saw fit. And what this meant was that actually Protestants, of course, but also most ordinary Catholics accepted these measures. They accepted the religious settlement for what it was, and there was only some Catholic dissent. We know that a sizable amount of the nobility in early Elizabethan England were recusant, which means they did not attend church services on a Sunday, instead preferring to have a private Latin Mass, usually in their own homes. But the Catholic dissent in England was never really supported from abroad. There was certainly none coming from the French, who were too busy and preoccupied with their own wars of religion. Spain as well started off the period as an English ally by virtue of Philip II's, of course, now dissolved marriage from to Mary I. But nevertheless, politically, Spain was still very much an ally of England, at least to start with. And of course, as we discussed in the previous video, the papacy offered very little leadership to English Catholics to start with. So where it had been expected that the Pope would excommunicate Elizabeth almost immediately after the religious settlement in 1559, no support was really forthcoming. And it took about a decade for the Pope to take serious action. It wasn't until 1570 that a papal bull excommunicated Elizabeth, declared her a heretic, and released English Catholics from their loyalty to Elizabeth. But it had no real effect because the inaction of the papacy in those 10 years had given the Church of England time to establish itself and given English Catholics 10 years to develop their loyalty to a Protestant queen. So by the time the papal bull did come about, it had no real effect. That being said, the arrival of Mary Queen of Scots in England after her being deposed by the Scottish in the 1560s had galvanised Catholic opposition in England to Elizabeth. and led almost immediately to the 1569 Northern Rebellion, which, of course, as we looked at last week, failed. But nevertheless, the fact that Elizabeth she took action to have 700 rebels put to death. In the end, I think only around 400 to 450 were actually executed. But nevertheless, having such a significant number of rebels put to death perhaps does indicate that Elizabeth and her government perceived the Northern Rebellion as a sizable threat, a significant threat. So although the Northern Rebellion actually failed, in its aftermath, some plotters would now use the fact that Mary was in England to plot against and try and depose Elizabeth. So one of the key questions I want to ask today is, how significant a threat were these plots against Elizabeth? And what you want to do when presented with such a question is you want to try and come up with your own kind of criteria, your own reasons for what makes a plot a significant threat. And just to give you an idea, things like, was there a clear and a reasonable, sensible plan, for example, on behalf of the plotters? Did they have significant support in England? Did they have support from abroad, such as from France, Spain, or the Pope? Did Elizabeth make mistakes that meant that the plot perhaps had greater chances of succeeding? So there's lots of ways that you can decide for yourself whether these plots were a significant threat. So let's just very quickly recap why Catholics were angry with Elizabeth I, at least some anyway. So as we already talked about, the religious settlement deprived Catholics in England of a Latin Mass, and they therefore believed that their salvation, their chance of going to heaven, was under threat because they could not worship in the way that their religion said that they should do so. And as a result, some 1/3 of the nobility became recusants, which means they did not attend Sunday church services, at least in the or under the ways that the Act of Uniformity said that they should. The second key reason is the belief that Mary Queen of Scots was the legitimate heir to Mary I of England, and not Elizabeth herself. And it's because they believed that Elizabeth herself was illegitimate. And of course, Mary's presence in England from 1568 presented the opportunity to replace Elizabeth with Mary, who of course was a Catholic herself. And thirdly, as we've already talked about, little action from the papacy until 1570, until Pope Pius V sends his papal bull releasing English Catholics from their loyalty to Elizabeth. But of course, as we've already talked about, it had very little effect. Nevertheless, it did mean that there were a number of Catholics in England who felt that they no longer had a political loyalty to their anointed queen because their spiritual leader, the Pope, had released them from it. So in this video, I'm now going to talk about 3 significant plots, and these are the 3 that you definitely need to learn if you are doing the Edexcel GCSE History Unit Early Elizabethan England. But of course, if you are here as a student of Elizabethan England generally, these are definitely 3 significant ones to learn. And it's also important to look at them through the lens of why, in the end, by 1587, Mary Queen of Scots was executed. I think that's a key question to ask. Some other key questions that you might want to look at here is, why did the Catholics plot against Elizabeth, which we've kind of touched on already? How significant were those plots? And again, I've talked about some ways in which you might judge that. So as you look at the plots now, that knowledge will help you to decide how significant each one was. And again, as a kind of add-on to that, which of them was the most significant threat to Elizabeth? And as I kind of already touched on, which of the plots best explains why Mary Queen of Scots in the end was executed in 1587. I've also added some little noun project icons here, just to kind of help you remember the details of the key feature of each one. So hopefully they will remind you of that once you've got the knowledge down. So let's make a start on the Ridolfi plot, the first that came along chronologically after the revolt on the Northern Elves. So Roberto Ridolfi was an Italian banker And it's quite possible, some say, that he might have been a double agent employed by Elizabeth's government to trap a nobleman, the Duke of Norfolk, and bring about his execution, because he's already been a little bit troublesome. There was already a plot that he was involved in that involved him marrying Mary Queen of Scots and they becoming Queen and King Consort of England. Now, Mary Queen of Scots was kind of involved here. She used Ridolfi to carry messages to the Duke of Alva in the Netherlands, the Pope as well, and Philip II of Spain, asking them to organise a foreign invasion of England. And the aim of the Ridolfi plot was, of course, to replace Elizabeth with Mary, who, along with the Duke of Norfolk, would restore Catholicism in England. But in the end, Elizabeth's government discovered the plot, and as a result, the Duke of Norfolk was found guilty and executed the following year, of course, for treason. Now, in the end, Ridolfi himself, because he was out of the country, could not be found guilty of anything. And so he basically retired to a quite comfortable life until he died in 1612. But what Elizabeth herself actually did about this was that she found herself under quite significant pressure from Protestant MPs to be harsher to Catholics. And so a law was passed stating that anyone who claimed Elizabeth was not the rightful queen was in fact a traitor. And this kind of isn't surprising, because now this is the second time that Catholics have been involved in a major movement against the Queen herself. So we've had the Northern Rebellion 2 years before, and now the Ridolfi plot. And you might have heard the phrase, if you give them an inch, people take a yard, or give them a yard, take them, or so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say here is that Catholics who have been tolerated quite a lot in this period up until now seem to be causing the Queen an awful lot of trouble. So that's the first major plot. The second came along in 1583, so just over 10 years later, and we've got a guy called Francis Throckmorton, and he was basically a go-between for Mary Queen of Scots and the French and Spanish ambassadors. He was also in contact with English Catholic nobles, and the aim of his plot was to achieve the overthrow of Queen Elizabeth through an invasion by a French army led by the Duke of Guise, who is pictured there on the left. The invasion would also receive sponsorship, i.e. money, from Philip II of Spain. And as those Catholic powers invaded, it would also coincide with an uprising by English Catholics in England as well. However, it failed because the plot was discovered by Walsingham's spy network before it became public knowledge, and evidence in Throckmorton's possession incriminated several other Catholics. One of the other reasons it probably failed, according to Throckmorton anyway, was that basically the plan had stalled because money promised by Philip II had never arrived. Whether that's true or not, it's hard to say, because many of the details of this plot were gathered through torture, which of course is not a reliable method of gaining intelligence. In the event, Throckmorton was executed in 1584 after having claimed that Mary Queen of Scots again was involved in the plot, though he later withdrew this. And so, with 3 Catholic actions against Elizabeth since 1569, it's clear now that the Catholics are becoming a real problem. But not only that, Mary Queen of Scots, whether she likes it or not, has become the focus for the 3 plots so far. All of them involved to some extent freeing Mary from imprisonment and putting her on the English throne. And it's not surprising then that Elizabeth's government now begins to ramp up its efforts to find concrete evidence of Mary's involvement in the plotting, hence my little magnifying glass here, because the government is going to try and find that evidence. They need to find it in order that they can justify whether or not the execution or indefinite imprisonment of Mary Queen of Scots. So the final plot comes along in 1586, and it's called the Babington plot. So Anthony Babington was a young Catholic, and he had been involved with those that were basically responsible for Mary's custody. And he did carry letters for Mary, But in 1586, it became involved in more serious plots. Anthony Babington in July 1586 wrote to Mary Queen of Scots outlining 6 steps to free England from Protestantism, including invasion by a foreign army, possibly Spain, with whom England was now at war by this point. They'd been at war, England-Spain, since 1585. So the first 4 steps of the plan basically involved just that, trying to get a foreign army to invade England. But it was step 5 and step 6 that were really, really important in incriminating Mary Queen of Scots. Step 5 was the freeing of Mary herself, and step 6 was the dispatch of the usurper. In other words, the plotters had put in writing their very intent to kill Elizabeth. Now, Mary had been convinced by people that she was with that hiding her messages in beer barrels was a safe way to communicate with the outside world. But actually, those that had convinced her to do that were most likely spies working for Elizabeth's government. And so Mary had been sending secret letters hidden in these beer barrels, but of course they were intercepted and sent to Walsingham. And by replying to Babington's letters, Walsingham, the spy master, can now say that Mary had very much given her consent to such a plan to dispatch Elizabeth. And in fact, the reply that Mary gave was that the assassins would need 4 stout men furnished with good and speedy horses. This was the concrete evidence that Walsingham needed and that Elizabeth's government needed to say that Mary was guilty. And so it was that Mary was moved to Fotheringay Castle, 120 miles from London, to begin her trial. She was found guilty, unsurprisingly, and she was then executed there in February 1587. So to summarise, there were 3 plots that took place against Elizabeth between 1571 and 1586 that were organised by Catholics. The Ridolfi and Throckmorton plots, in addition to the assassination of William Orange in 1584 and the looming war with Spain, convinced Elizabeth's government of the need for harsher treatment of Catholics. In addition, particularly after the Throckmorton plot, Walsingham himself became more determined to find proof of Mary's involvement, and this was finally secured during the Babington plot, which sealed Mary's fate. Although uneasy about such a decision, Elizabeth eventually acquiesced to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587, although she found herself under considerable pressure from her Privy Council, many of whom were Protestants or Puritans that very much feared the return to the throne of a Catholic monarch. Mary's eventual execution, therefore, removed an important threat to Elizabeth and ended the likelihood of a Catholic heir succeeding her as queen. In this video today, I've talked a little bit about the 3 plots that followed the Northern Rebellion in 1569 and why they were significant. What I would say now is, particularly if you are revising this unit, is to be confident in your judgment of why each plot was significant, and you can go back to my knowledge organiser for this. So think about the consequences of each one, what happened as a result. But again, you also want to think about which of these were the most significant threats to Elizabeth herself, and which of these plots did the most to explain why Mary Queen of Scots was executed in 1587. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.